everyone. This is Anna Hicks with Spivey Consulting Group. I'm here today with Mike Spivey, who was asked recently on Reddit to do a holiday AMA, so we are here today to do that. Mike, are you ready to answer some questions?
I am ready. I have my puppy Loki, which stands for Letter of Continued Interest in the background. So apologies if you hear barking or someone biting me.
Wait a second. I thought you've been telling Karen repeatedly that it does not stand for Letter of Continued Interest. So first question, does it or does it not stand for Letter of Continued Interest?
It does not, but Lokis in law school admissions are pronounced like the Norse god Loki. So there was a double entendre there, but it's spelled like the god of mischief, which she very much is.
And you can hear Noodle voicing her support for Loki in the background of mine.
Thank you. I wanted to disclaim that is not my puppy. My puppy does not sound anything like that big of a dog.
Nope, that's fully grown 80-pound Noodle. So let's get into the admissions questions. We have a few questions that are sort of more general about the application process, and then we have a bunch that are about this cycle specifically. So I was going to start with the more general ones and then get into the body of the questions, which are about the idiosyncrasies of this particular cycle. So let's get into it.
Sounds good.
The first poster says, I would like some more detail about how character and fitness plays into decisions. In a brief exchange, you told me I could pretty much expect the same results I would without CNF concerns, just with a delay. You mentioned there were reasons for your claim that you didn't have time to get into. Without doxing me, would you mind going into those reasons?
Yeah, this is sort of a difficult question because I get hundreds of CNF questions on Reddit. And just as a sort of an FYI and a disclaimer, there are some weeks I actually go in there and answer every single one. And some weeks, as you know, Anna, I just don't have time.
Sure.
Because I'm getting reached out to on LinkedIn and Twitter and 300 emails. So apologies to anyone who, if they sent me a Reddit direct message question, I didn't get to it. But I think I've always wanted to sort of message that. It's never the question or the person's name asking the question. It's really my schedule, which is just how the world works. We as a firm, as you know, Anna, because you do this more than I do, we outreach to people all the time. Sometimes they get back to us and sometimes they can't.
Yep.
What I would say is this. We did a Zoom 4-person video podcast about character and fitness. And between the four of us, we had, I think, over 100 years admissions experience. And we could only think of, I think, maybe 5 cases where the character and fitness issue alone caused the person not to be admitted. Almost always, 99.9%, and incidentally, 100% of the direct messages I've received on the former board, I think it was Top Law Schools, and Reddit. So we're talking now about thousands of direct messages of, hey, will this character and fitness handicap me? It might slow you down, but I've yet to see one where they're going to pull up the gate to the castle. In our Zoom video, these were all either heinous criminal acts, keeping in mind that, I know of law schools that have admitted someone convicted of murder. There's always two sides to every story. And or a combination of academic, like there was one that was an academic fraud. So then I got a bunch of direct messages, hey, I also have an academic fraud. But in the case that we talked about in the Zoom video, it was an academic fraud combined with a felony.
Right.
And I totally get it. Like, if I were an applicant with no admissions experience and I had like a DUI, I would probably be like losing sleep. Unfortunately, what applicants can't see is that law schools see so many of these that none of these by themselves, like one DUI, one CNF, almost never does anything but slows the process down. Actually, I think I remember the person's specific thing. It was 3. There were 3. None of which themselves were that big of a deal. But when you combine 3 different kind of infractions, then yeah, what they're going to do is, even if you have good numbers, that might put you aside. So now I'm going to finally answer the question directly. They put you aside, and then later in the cycle, there will be some schools that say, where's that pool that we put aside? Let's take another look at them. And they've become so desensitized to minor character and fitness issues, including 3. Right. Then they're like, oh, it's not a big deal. Why didn't we admit them earlier? That's what I meant.
Okay, so that's what the delay is. That makes total sense.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. This poster says, what are your thoughts on scholarships versus taking out debt? What would you include in a cost-benefit analysis, and how would you make a decision using it?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question that we received in not just the 9-year history of our firm, but I've heard before that when I was in admissions. The way I would answer it, and you've heard me say this on it many times, is, we don't make that decision for our clients. They know their financial situation. We don't. They know their risk aversion sort of matrix. We don't.
Yeah.
What I would say is, I think that there is too much of an emphasis on rankings.
Sure.
So I would not say, well, school X is ranked 7 and school Y is ranked 9. So I would go to X over Y despite the money. That makes no sense. And law firms and almost all employers don't think like that. I think if your lifelong ambition is to work in legal academia, be a judge or high level government department head, and you have the money, those are the only cases where I tip towards, like the T3 don't give merit aid. So those are the 3 cases where I tip towards prestige over 3 beats 4. Now I say that and the number 4 ranked law school is going to call me and tell me what a jerk I am. But so be it. In most cases, I say, use your number 3 ranked admit to get more money from number 4, and then that's your decision. Scholarship's a funny thing because applicants have done it 0 times and schools have done it thousands of times.
Scholarship negotiation.
Correct. But oftentimes applicants don't ask politely, and you need to ask politely. They don't ask politely the correct number of times, which is more than once. Schools giving you money is very time dependent. They give out millions of dollars over their budget, and then they get millions of dollars back. People tell them they're not going to the schools. So my answer to the question is, I cannot say any line other than I did give a line in sort of certain career paths. But I can say that we see the mistake all the time that the applicant could have gotten more money and then had maybe an easier decision to make. For example, I will give a real example because I know this helps the audience. I would take a full ride at the number 10 school, the number 9 school, the number 8 school, over 0 money from the number 4 school every day of the week. One of my mentors, Jeff Chapman, who's the M&A practice chair at Gibson Dunn, he talked a client of mine out of going to his alma mater, Harvard Law School, to take a half ride at Columbia. And Jeff, you've had dinner with him. I mean, I don't want to out my mentor, but he's a pretty prestige-laden guy. I should say disparage. I've already outed him. Jeff cares a lot about prestige.
Well, this is a top guy at a top vault law firm.
Yeah, he brings in billions of dollars a year in M&A deals. He cares a lot about prestige, but I had a client that was just torn. So I was like, hey, I can't do this for everyone, but maybe Jeff will have a few minutes. And sure enough, Jeff said, consider your debt. And they talked it out. And he's like, I would recommend you go to Columbia over Harvard. I'm going to be wary of adding my personal take. As you know, I'm pretty wary of debt. But everyone has their own, everyone falls on some continuum of risk. I just happen to be at the far, don't take on debt end of it. But that's just me personally.
Sure. Okay, let's move on. I actually have one question that I would like to add that is general as opposed to specifically about this cycle. And I want to add this question because I could have sworn I saw someone ask you on Reddit, but now I can't find it for the life of me.
I remember you telling me that someone asked me this and then we couldn't find it, right?
Well, I'm going to ask it anyway. What should applicants do if they submit an application or multiple applications and then they go back and read it later and they find a mistake?
Yeah, it probably depends on the mistake. But in general, if you haven't received a decision, here's how the process works. Let's say you go back and you read your personal statement and you find 4 typos. What I personally would do is just resend via email to the admissions office. Hi, I wanted to provide you with an updated version of my personal statement. It would be great if you could add it to my file, and I very much appreciate it. Have a wonderful week. Because the person who receives that email has nothing to do with the admissions process. And they don't have time. They're not going to pull out your old personal statement, read it, find the 4 typos. I hate guarantees, but I would all but guarantee this has never happened. The administrative person whose responsibility it is to put together applications has never received a phone call or email, taken the time out of their busy day to read an application who they have no decision-making responsibilities for, find an old version and spot check and find the 4 typos, circle them, and then give it to the dean of admission. It's never happened. So in general, I tip towards just, if no decision has been made, just sending a very polite email with an updated version. This happens all the time. So to begin with, I can remember maybe 1% of applications or less being flawless when I used to read applications on the admission side. Almost all of them included some sort of typo. It's just applications are 12 to 15 pages long. Number 2, I can remember every day our front office administrative team answering emails and phone calls, which were, hey, I made a mistake. Sadly, sometimes those were panic phone calls and they didn't need to be. Can you, insert this corrected version? Easy done. The harder part is if you've received a decision already, because that's when you want to stop sounding neurotic. I mean, if you get denied, do whatever you want. They can't double deny you. If you're waitlisted, I would be very wary because it's probably has nothing to do with the waitlist. You probably think it might. Again, applicants don't have the privilege of having done admissions for many years. So you might think your 2 typos had something to do with your waitlist. Incredibly unlikely. What would be more deleterious would be if you sent them a panicked waitlist email. Oh my God, I'm so sorry you never got the right personal statement. Please immediately reread. That's going to be a huge red flag, and that might turn, strong waitlist considerabilities into a weak waitlist considerabilities as far as admit.
Are there any situations where an applicant has not received a decision yet and they find any sort of mistake where you would say, don't send in an update, it's not worth it to send in an update, it doesn't make sense?
Yeah. It's funny because my mind can span the continuum. On one extreme, if you're missing one comma, I just wouldn't bother. But, I say this and then people are going to blame me if they get denied with one comma.
Right.
Right? To be clear, they may have one comma missing in the application, but to be clear, that is not why they were denied. No one has ever been denied for that reason that I can possibly imagine. On the far other end of the continuum, maybe there are some scenarios where I wouldn't want to call attention to something I said. But if you say, can you please delete that one sentence where I intimated I hated my professor? Keeping in mind, nothing ever gets deleted from your application. They just get updated versions. I guess I could see 2 ends of the continuum. I think I'm going to have to get off direct messages for a week after this part because I think I'm going to get a lot of people saying, I submitted this. Should I or should I not update? I would go back to our first part of this conversation, which is if you haven't received a decision, in the vast majority of cases, it's really easy to say, here's my updated resume. Here's my updated personal statement. If you're waitlisted, I would be much more wary.
Okay, that makes sense. And thank you for that detailed response. This actually brings us to the questions about this cycle specifically, which I know you've talked about at length. So let's get ready to talk about it some more. So our first question is, how much will T14 LSAT medians increase this cycle?
Here's the amusing thing, I think, to applicants. Law schools actually ask me the same question. So if your law school is ranked, not in the top 14, but maybe around, and I have a relationship with that law school, sometimes I'll hear from their dean or dean of admission, what's your projection? I would say this. Every year in admissions, there are winners and losers in LSAT scores, winners and losers in GPA. And by that, I mean from the school's perspective. This year, there will be more winners than losers. And we'll probably see that on the +1 and +2 side of things in the T14. Will every school in the T14 go up an LSAT point? Probably not, because I think some schools are going to increase class sizes. But when you look at our beautiful spreadsheet you do, Anna, with the green and the red, with the medians, and the green is +1 for some schools, we've seen years where the majority of schools are at 0 or negative. This year, it's going to be the majority of schools are at +1 or +2, I would believe. Things can change. LSAC might give a different answer than I would to that question, but I see a majority of schools being in the plus category. I think you're going to see, just as a side, outside of the T14, and maybe, well outside, but maybe not, you'll see some +3, and you might even see a +4 school or two.
Well, that will certainly be interesting to see once we start getting that data. So that actually brings us to the next question pretty nicely, which is, do you think that undergraduate GPA is going to be more important this cycle?
Such an interesting question. What I think is going to happen possibly is if you have a combination of schools overly targeting LSAT increases and a decrease of LSAT scores in a certain bandwidth. Let's say the 165 to 170, which to me is the most likely to come down to organic levels as far as the top bandwidths. Right now, the 170 and above, we don't think those are going to return anything naturally to organic levels. But let's say that the 165 to 169 comes down some. Then you could see schools in that range, maybe a school with a 165 was targeting a 168, and they give up that aspiration in March, And then all of a sudden you see a deluge of high GPA people admitted in March. Now, obviously, I can't see into the future, so I don't know what bandwidth that's going to happen in. But in those bandwidths, I think you will see a sharp shift of focus. I don't know, February, March, April, May, away from LSAT scores and towards people with strong GPAs, which just gets back to the fact that this is going to feel like a very slow cycle. It already does to some people, and it'll continue to feel slow for some people.
So what I think was implied in your answer is that schools right now are not focusing on undergraduate GPA. For right now, at least, it seems like schools are focusing on LSAT scores, but that might shift sort of later on.
I mean, if I want to put my dean of admissions hat on, keeping in mind I've told a number of admissions and law school people over the years focus more on GPA and less on LSAT. And there's a lot of reasons why that's worthy. But I think this would be the year, if anything, where if I were a dean of admissions early on, I would be focusing on LSAT, not GPA, for sure.
Yeah. So that continues to be relevant into our next question, which is, how do you think splitters will fare this application cycle? So specifically for people who might have that high LSAT, which you're saying law school admissions offices are likely focusing on right now, but then they have a lower GPA, are schools going to be more forgiving of that?
I would say early on, splitters might be favored, because I think if I were a dean of admission, if there were any year I was going to go from, normally maybe if I were targeting a +1 LSAT, this would be the year I might be targeting a +2 or a +3.
Yeah. So our next question, this poster says, I've seen your posts acknowledging that this cycle will be competitive due to the surge in high LSAT scores, particularly at top schools. Do you think that increase in competitiveness will be felt evenly for T14/T20 schools, or if any subsets, such as Harvard, Yale, Stanford, the bottom half of the T14, etc., would be more or less competitive than other subsets?
Yeah, well, one subset would be the 170 and above, because that bandwidth is up pretty dramatically. And, LSAC has their statement, but the bottom line is you would have to go back in time for that to come down to normal levels.
Yeah.
They can't. So there's one subset. And I don't even mean schools with a current median of 170 and above. But, if you're targeting that, there's just more applications in that group now. 175 and above is up 110%. And 170 and 174 was up, last I checked, 50-something percent. As of last week, if no one ever applied again, LSATs 170 and above would be up 25% this cycle. But obviously, we're going to get tens of thousands of applications still. So that'll be a competitive set. The other thing I think people want to be cognizant of is, what were the schools last year that admitted a very large, abnormally large, because of moving to remote deferral class? That's just something to keep in mind, because they're already starting ahead.
Right. Our next question is actually about deferrals. This poster says, curious how you think schools' announcements about whether class will be in person next year might affect this cycle. I know a bunch of people from the previous cycle deferred for a year, presumably opening spots for people on the wait list. Do you think the same might happen this time around?
Well, as you know, we follow the pandemic and now the vaccine and vaccination process very closely as a firm. Not just that, but the economy and other things.
Yeah.
And I think that the scenario I see right now is law schools will be fully back in person next year, keeping in mind people start in September. So in that scenario, I see less people deferring, more people going to law school. And some of these law schools already have some of their class full from last year. So to answer the question very directly, I would then therefore anticipate less wait list movement, not more.
Okay, so here's a question about the LSAT Flex. Do you think that people who scored a 175 or above on the LSAT Flex will be seen as true 175 plussers after the band inflation? So presumably, in future cycles.
Yeah, for sure. Look, a school's not sitting around saying, this person has a 175, so they're 1 point more intelligent than the 174, right? What they're really thinking of is, what are the medians of our competitor schools versus ours, and what are our goals? I don't ever really see a scenario where a school has a median 175. I mean, not in the short term. I've never seen a median of 174, and I've seen very competitive cycles. There may, I don't want to create a market panic, there may or may not be a school that gets a median of 174 this year. So let's pretend there is. No way of knowing, to be determined. But let's pretend there is. The 175 is still a 175, which is still above the median. No different. So there's no devaluation of a 175.
Great. Okay, so our next question. How are non-traditional applicants going to fare this upcoming cycle? And then somewhat related to that, how are part-time programs going to be impacted this cycle?
Yeah, I mean, non-traditional, I think, falls into that category. And let me define non-traditional. Generally, that means people with work experience who are, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20, 30. When I was at Vanderbilt Law School, we admitted a Vietnam War vet. So, 50 years, 60 years life experience. One of the pieces of happy news of this cycle is that later in the summer, some schools are going to be so locked into their medians that they're going to admit people purely for reasons of softs. And that tends to often favor people who are non-traditional. I can think of a client of mine he was a plumber and in his 40s, and he, hit home run after home run. This goes back to the scholarship thing. I think he chose his state school with a full ride over like a top 10 school, no money, incidentally. Great decision for him. He was a single father. He was favored that cycle because of his 20 years work experience. And he just, had a very compelling, awesome story. And people with compelling, differentiated, awesome stories are going to be favored this summer, I think, when medians get locked in.
Okay. And then how about those part-time programs?
Schools have been underwritten by central universities ever since the Great Recession, and that well is drying up or has entirely dried up already. So I would see transfer class sizes growing. I would see JD class sizes growing. And for schools with part-time programs, I would see those class sizes growing. So when the class size grows, if there's not a corresponding equivalency in growth in applications, which there may not be for the part-time programs, then it gets to be less competitive.
Okay, so our next question is one that probably will not make sense to you, the listener, unless you are on Reddit right now. So if you're listening to this a year from now, or if you're listening to this and you're not really on Reddit, this may not make sense. But Mike, maybe you can explain the context. This question is just, what is Georgetown's plan?
Yeah, it's funny because Dean Kornblatt was on, I guess, MSNBC this morning. Right before, someone sent me a picture of him on MSNBC talking about applications being up. I have no idea what he was talking about because I wasn't watching the news. Pro tip, don't watch the news. But what I would say is, I don't know. He doesn't call me and tell me their plan. I think maybe one way of looking at this, and I'm not going to really speculate on any individual school. As you know, I'm very hesitant to do that. One way to look at this is maybe Georgetown is just one of the few schools that people are interested in that's made a lot of decisions already. So right now, the question of popularity is what in the world is Georgetown doing? But it might be 2 weeks from now, what in the world is NYU, Penn? I'm just making these up, obviously.
Yeah.
It could be any other school. Georgetown just may be the school that's making lots of admissions decisions. So the focus might be on them. Pretty soon, early January, you're going to see a lot more schools make a lot more admissions decisions early, mid-January. So I think it might just be more of a product of Georgetown slogging through applications a lot more rapidly. I think there's some anecdotal data, at least, that there's more deny decisions and waitlist decisions early on, but not nearly as many admit decisions relative to the applicant pool, which would be a function of the confusing data, but more so the messaging from LSAC, I think, is what's confusing. The data is not confusing to us. It's the data is up. The data is just the data.
Well, so that actually brings me to a question that I was going to ask. Over the years, I've seen people troll you, impersonate you, post false things about the company.
Right.
And it always seems to just roll right off your back. You take it in stride. And for that matter, I've also seen LSAC publicly say things that you disagreed with or thought were not right. But again, it's never really seemed to ruffle you. Until this year.
Right.
So my question is, what makes this current situation with LSAC different, and why have you reacted differently?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You see the public messaging where I'm pretty aggravated, and then you get to hear me on the phone where I'm very aggravated with LSAC. And I am. So here's how I would describe that. In all my previous years, there's always been complaints about LSAC from the market, and I've never really gotten involved in those complaints because from our perspective, they were providing a lot of signal and a little bit of noise. And this year, that's flipped entirely, where we're getting a lot of noise and very little signal. Well, we're getting signal. It's the same signal, but it's totally obscured by the noise. So let me explain what I mean by that. You've heard me before, and I'm sure, say in the past. I respect greatly all the effort LSAC is putting into accessibility, diversity, all the improvements they're trying to make. But I think they spend too much. I'm sure you've heard me say that because I've privately said that in the past. Right.
Yeah.
The problem is this year, their spin is, I would say, in disagreement with the actual data. So what they're presenting data that suggests that the LSAT scores are going to be way up at the top. I mean, I've seen the scaling data. It suggests that the LSAT Flex is not on par, not the same test as the LSAT. Let me be clear. I've seen the scaling data from about a month ago. So I don't see like their data in front of me right now as far as scaling data. I do see the volume data. I don't need the scaling data. I see the volume data. All of this data suggests that this is going to be a very competitive cycle. And LSAC keeps talking about, hey, this is a great cycle to apply if you want to be a lawyer. Well, maybe. I'm not saying it's not. If you want to be a lawyer and you don't have a job and you have good scores and a good application, then any cycle is a great cycle. Because schools have to do a lot of admitting. They have to matriculate this coming year 40,000 people. Would you rather apply in a cycle where 40,000 people are going to matriculate and 45,050 are applying? Or 72,000 are applying? You can answer that own question. LSAC is so focused on not panicking the market that they're tone deaf to the fact that the market can see the data and is always worried, and they just want good advice. And by market, I don't just mean law school applicants, although that's my primary concern, but I also worry about pre-law advisors who advise the applicant pool. And I also worry about law schools who are going slower because they're about to make, true story, 400 admits, and then they get an email, and an email went out last week, blah, 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 natural, organic, blah, blah, blah. And then the school calls me and says, should we hold off on making these admits? So from my perspective, LSAC is harming the natural process by unnaturally inserting speculation that is biased. The spin is superseding the reality from my position. To their credit, I think 2 weeks ago, they had said in the media that they project application increases of 10%. And then on their blog this weekend, they said 10 to 20%. So, at some point, we sort of think that they're going to say, hey, here's the reality, here's the data. And the sooner they say that in accordance with what the data shows everyone else, I think the better for the applicants, the better for the schools, the better for pre-law advisors.
Right.
So that's my frustration. What we would rather do is recognize the reality and then help people understand the reality and make informed decisions. And I get that LSAC, has multiple things to consider that I probably haven't even thought of. It's so rare that I get into other people's business, which is why you mentioned I ignore a lot of stuff. Right. So, I try not to tell people how to live their lives or run their businesses. LSAC probably is considering things. They have a side to this that we don't. I would just say that whatever the reason is for the test being different, the fact is the test scores are different. So maybe let's just throw aside all the hypotheses and say it's a different test in a more competitive cycle.
Well, thanks for that, Mike. That is all of the questions that we have for today, and thank you for answering them. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I would like to add that I hope everyone has a safe and peaceful and happy holidays. And there probably won't be, a slew of admissions decisions coming out December 25th to the 2nd. But then I think there's going to be a huge uptick. And I appreciate that a group of people ask these questions online. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And hopefully this was helpful.